Always good to see everybody here. We're all like on different time schedules, so I'm still, I think it's 3 in the morning in Los Angeles, but that's okay. Yes, we're going to talk about this concept of chaos in writers' rooms, which are really run in chaos, at least the ones in the United States. Just a quick background on who I am. I was in the business for several years. I wrote Picket Fences, Beverly Hills 90210, which is the show that won't die because they just did a live, or is just a little crazy, and Touched by an Angel for a long time. So this is where I came from in television. This is what I've done in academia and writing. My favorite new book is a collection of essays written by many of my students about female screenwriters from the early days and giving us their backgrounds. So I'm all about finding more women that we can write about and talk about in our classes. I think that's important. I'm also the book review editor of Journal of Screenwriting, so if you have any books you'd like to review, please let me know. I'd love to get you a free copy and get your review in the journal. And also I'm on the editorial board for the Written By magazine, which is the magazine of the Writers Guild of America. You can access that for free digitally online. If you go to writtenby.com or go to the WGA.org, and they'll have a link to it. But every month we do interviews with either a film person or a television person or a whole writer's room from a show. And I think it's a great way to bring guest stars into a classroom from all over the world. Again, they're obviously Americans, although I interviewed Russell Davies several years ago, so we do have some other folks come on in to the magazine, but it's pretty cool. I work for Stevens College, which is actually located in Missouri. However, our MFA program is low residency, so students join us in Los Angeles for 10 days each year for their 2-year MFA, and we work at this Jim Henson Studios, which are in Los Angeles. So it's now, Kermit is our little mascot, but that's how we're organized. So we're from Missouri, but I live in LA. This is my teaching philosophy. Words matter, writers matter, women writers matter, and that's something I try to focus on as much as possible. There's a lot of women who never get mentioned, and that bothers me, but that's a different lecture. So I did that last year. This year, we're talking about why writers are important and how the writers' room works. As far as I'm concerned, we have to remember that writer precedes director. So I want more of our students to know the names of the writers of their favorite films, not always just the directors. Because when you talk about a film, you don't say, do you remember that beautiful camera angle in scene 7? You say, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father, prepare to die. And that is something the writer did. So I think we have to remember that the dialogue is what makes movies special, and the characters. So that's kind of my philosophy. I really don't like the auteur theory, and neither do a lot of other writers. This particular quote comes to us from the gentleman who gave us, in America, Breaking Bad, Vince Gilligan. So I want to talk about writers' rooms, and his is considered one of the most organized, so perhaps the less chaotic, but still what happens in the room has its own form of chaos. So I think it's really interesting that he is willing to defend the idea that writers are more important than directors. He's certainly got an Emmy to prove he's an important writer. But I appreciate very much what he had to say. The room is about making people as comfortable as possible. And this can be a difficult task, but it's the task of the executive producer or the showrunner to make sure that the people in the room are open to sharing as many of their interesting ideas as possible. Right? So chaos, but managed chaos. You have to allow for much conversation, but you're the one managing what's being said so you don't run off on a tangent. And of course, Vince was brilliant at that. In terms of the history of writers' rooms, comedy sort of always had them. And we know that going back in the early days of the George Burns and Gracie Allen show, he had a team of writers, including his brother, who worked with him. So comedy always knew that it needed a group. It was as if they knew the sitcom was an outgrowth of stand-up comedy or those vaudeville acts they had all been in. Of course, we love the Dick Van Dyke Show taught many people in America, many females in America, you could write for television because there was a female character writing for television, right, in the 60s. So that taught us we had a place in this business, which is a good thing. Neil Simon worked in early TV comedy shows, and so then he glamorized that in his play. So that's a way people learn about writers' rooms. They see it operate, and this was a room that included very famous men, Larry Gelbart, who did MASH, Woody Allen, who we can say other things about these days. I did a whole book on the Monkees, and they had one of the first writers' rooms in a sort of a kids show sitcom. And so I had the chance to meet with and interview all these writers back in about 3 years ago, who were all in their late 70s, and so heard about their stories of how the room operated. It was very important to have a female. It was the first sitcom that had a female on staff. And so she added a perspective. So it started the idea that we need inclusion in our rooms. We need to hear all the different perspectives. I thought that was pretty cool. So that's the book and the article that I wrote for Written By. But 1-hour dramas did not involve writers' rooms in the beginning. And I find that very fascinating because we rely on them now. But they did not, in fact, they literally had writer pools. And if you were running a show, so you were the creator of the show, you would walk down the hallway to the pool. Of course, that's the typing pool. And it was a bunch of guys, not too many women involved at that time. And you would say, I need an episode of Columbo. Who's free this week? And that person would have to come up with an episode of Columbo. The NBC Mystery Movie was a perfect example of that because every Sunday there was a different one of these shows. They weren't a weekly show. And so you had some time to prepare it. So you'd walk down the street and say, I don't know, which of these shows we need this next week? And so writers' rooms took freelance ideas. And you didn't sit in the room and break the story together. And that has been something that's evolved over time, I think is interesting. In this writers' pool at Universal, which contributed to that show, were all these men who became the showrunners of the second golden age of television. And they all are men whose shows have run on television incessantly. And I think that's where we started to learn that, particularly in television, you had to find people with a defined voice. And that is something you could build a show around. And so when I define voice, everyone has a slightly different concept. But to me, it's a simple matter of your opinion and the style in which you deliver it. And that tells us your different voice. And I think some of the shows I'm going to mention, it's very clear they have very unique voices. And that's where they come from. So we started to recognize that the idea of the creator in television was the writer, and that person should run the entire show themselves and should begin to gather about them a group of people who could mimic their voice while still keeping their own. That was the difficult job of television, which is also still a difficult thing to teach students, to write a spec script that sounds like but doesn't obliterate your own voice. And that's what you're trying to do in the room, which again is more chaotic than I would say. Stephen Cannell, who was the first person I worked for as an assistant, they tell a great story when he was in the writer's pool at Universal. They came in for this show, Adam 12. They said, we need an idea for the show. Who wants to write one? And the first thing that came to him was their policeman who rode around in a squad car all day. And his unique idea was, what if they got the squad car that was misbehaving, that had engine trouble and a flat tire and everything went wrong with the car? So the whole episode is about these men managing the tool of their job more than managing what the crime of the week was. And that stood out in people's minds. He was using the formula in a different way. And that started to make people pay attention to him so that he could leave and do other things. I was able to interview a certain set of these men, actually Stephen Cannell in the year before he died, to talk about their time at Universal and the transition from this pool into their own rooms and how they would comprise those rooms. Again, all these men that I just mentioned are famous because of what they came up with. Cannell is someone we know from many action adventure television shows. When he passed away, the show Castle, which was big in the United States, the men who worked on that show had been in his writer pools early in their career. So he was famous for this ending on his show where he would type in the typewriter and pull the paper out. That was his brand. At the end of this show, Castle, which he did not work on, they gave this colleague, mentor, friend ending in tribute to him. So that's how important he was to their careers. They learned how to run their own rooms from working with him. These are all the shows that you probably know him from at some point or another. So he's certainly a man with a very distinct style that stood out for a long time. Then, of course, we have Stephen Bochco, who gave us as was said in the keynote, the multi-level story, many characters with different goals. He brought that to television in a way that it hadn't existed before. Adam 12 was a very basic, two guys do cop things all day. This was now groups of people. Here we had the policemen with their own personal lives at home. Later we'll have LA Law, the lawyers with their own personal lives, NYPD Blue. So that was what Bochco brought to television. Don Belisario brought us franchises, hence the McDonald's. But he brought us the idea that we could take the one concept, the format, and keep expanding it into different things. And his writer rooms were very particular rooms. Belisario, I just messed that up, I'm sorry. I didn't mean Belisario, I meant Dick Wolf. Don Belisario gave us the military on television, and that is a very distinct voice in America. It speaks to a part of the population that doesn't feel they're serviced by television, right, which they think is all run by liberal elites. So to glorify our military is a thing that is very popular in some parts of the country, and that's because Don Belisario was from the military, so he wanted to express that part of his life in writing. Kenny Johnson brought science fiction more seriousness, right? So he started with The Bionic Woman, he moved on to The Incredible Hulk, then V, and then Alienation, which was a really beautiful show about alienation and assimilation into new cultures, all done through science fiction. So he brought social justice to science fiction, and that was a very distinct way that his voice worked. And I got to be his assistant for a while. So there's something missing in these early writers' rooms. Who's not in that picture? Mm-hmm. It's kind of obvious, you know? So we have these shows that we admire greatly, but they didn't have a female perspective. Hello? They were missing, and their opinion is missing, and I think that's a problem. But then along came Buffy, and Buffy had a staff that included many female writers, some of whom are now credited with giving it the feminist bent that it had. Joss Whedon may have started the show, but now we also know, like Woody Allen, there are things we don't like about him. So it seems that it was the women on the staff who maintained that feminist idea, right up to the point where they created the first lesbian couple on television, Tara and Willow, and that was a big step in American television. So Buffy's a big step. Now, here we have a room for Orange is the New Black, which has many females, but it's missing something different. Yes? A person of color, exactly. And yet the show itself was filled with women of color as characters, right? So again, we have to address that issue. We're not getting all the perspectives we can. Now we have this thing online that's called #ShowUsYourRoom. The Writers Guild started, and so people are taking pictures of their diverse rooms. And if you haven't taken a picture, it's because you're not diverse enough yet. So it's kind of a fun thing. So I wanted to talk about what it's like. What's the operation of a writer's room? And I love that this game is, of course, based on Rick and Morty, a TV show. So we're blending TV into all these other medium now. You have to think about what kind of writer's room you're working. There are different kinds that we've had experience with. My friend Lisa Seidman is a writer from Los Angeles. Some Russian producers came to Los Angeles. They wanted a person who had written soap operas, both afternoon and evening soap operas, who could speak Russian and who had been a screenwriting teacher, because they wanted that person to move to Russia for a few years, start the show, Anastasia, poor Anastasia, and teach a writing room how it should work, so that she could then leave and they could manage it themselves. And she tells a lovely story about one scene she had this is of course about the days of the Tsar. And so you have lovely rich people fencing, two lovely young men having a fencing match, a practice. And at the end of it, they take off their attire and they put on their nice shirts with the lace and they walk away. And the men in her writing room, the Russian men, said, well, the scene is over when we know who won the match. And she said, no, this is a soap opera. The scene is over when the women see their chests. So she was teaching them what you need inside a soap opera, right? So they wanted a teaching writing room, and that's what she was able to provide. In the case of this show on Stars, Vida, it's the story of three Latinx women in Los Angeles who had moved away but come home when their mother dies, and they discover that they've inherited a bar. And the bigger discovery is that they've co-inherited it with their mother's lesbian lover. So now they've learned their mother's a lesbian, and they own a bar, and they're living in a part of LA that's going under gentrification. And the entire show is staffed by female Latinx writers. And so having a room that is entirely inclusive of the people on the show has been very special to them. Whether or not they're missing other perspectives, I can't say, right? But that's an experience that's making it an open place for them to tell their stories, which is very important. Queen Sugar is a director-led writer's room. Ava DuVernay, right, who's done several films. She now ran the show, she created it, and she brought in a team of writers who are in charge. So now everything comes from the visual with her, and you have to start with the visual when you tell a story. She has hired someone else to run the room, but they're thinking of her desire as they do it, right? So that's important. I think inclusive writer rooms obviously create more inclusive stories. I happen to adore Torchwood. I'm a big Russell Davies fan. And I love the stories he tells about how when he came to create the show, he created a female police officer whose husband stayed at home and took care of the house and the baby. And he hadn't seen enough of that on television, so he provided that in the story. And then as they went through, you got many more characters of color, characters from other backgrounds. It definitely shows, right? And I got to interview him, as I said, for Written By, and he said it was a very difficult thing to watch people watch television, seeing how badly so many were represented. So his rooms have always been about representation, and I think that's an important thing. So for me, what's interesting and important about a writer's room is what you have to do. In this case, there's a show called Fresh Off the Boat. It's based on the memories of an Asian American man and his immigrant family. And for their room, They wanted to make sure all the people they hired had an outsider perspective, people who understood what it was like to go to a new place and be different. And how do you manage that balance of I'm an American Korean, but my parents are truly Korean. And in moving to another country, the parents have given away part of the knowledge of their children because they won't share the same kind of childhood. So that was an important aspect that Nanachka Khan wanted to bring to her show. And really interesting that she's not a Korean American and she's running the show. So it's about an experience she shares emotionally, not the same ethnic experience. And so I think that's an interesting movement forward, which is pretty good. In terms of Handmaid's Tale, they talk about how much work ahead of time they have to do and how much he wants the whole staff to contribute. He doesn't want to be the full runner of the show, Bruce Miller. He wants everyone to be part of what he's creating because he recognizes he's a man running a show about women being oppressed in this Margaret Atwood's future. So he has a particular take there. And of course, we're back to Vince Gilligan, who I love greatly. He's talking about making people feel comfortable, which I said, and I think comfort is very, very important. It has to be a safe place so that everyone is willing to tell their story. I laugh because my first days on Touched by an Angel, the way they got all the writers to know each other was everyone had to tell the story of how they lost their virginity. And once you told that to a room full of strangers, you were willing to tell anything else. So it was an interesting first day of work, to be sure. I'm not sure that qualifies as safe anymore, but we'll see. Now, Friends provides an interesting case study because they were sued by the writer's assistant who said the room was unsafe to her. She didn't like the kind of sexual conversation that went on. She did not win that lawsuit because it was understood that your presumption going into that job, a show about a bunch of single people in New York, is that we're going to be discussing these things, and you should be comfortable in that or take a job in a different show. So that was an interesting, how do we run a room safe but open? And I don't know that we found a perfect answer to that yet. I think they got away with what they did because they were all new. It was their first show. Look how young they were. This is them nowadays, right? So they weren't sure how to run things, right? They were working the best they could. Tina Fey obviously has run a couple of shows quite well, and I like what she has to say about what happens in the room. Her voice is always so clear. You know that's her, that humor she can't keep away from. I think that's really kind of interesting. And they run the room together, and a married couple. That's a unique and interesting way to run a room, right? And that's true for 30 Rock and Kimmy Schmidt. And he did the music for her Broadway play on Mean Girls. Now, when I was on Touched by an Angel, we had a whole lot of other things that we learned. I began in the business as a receptionist, and then I became a writer's assistant on these shows. So I sat in these rooms as these ideas were being broken. I got to watch the evolution of that job, which was a new thing, letting someone in the room with the writers. They hadn't done that before. But with the advent of computers, they wanted someone to keep a log of who said what. So we always had that information. So that was interesting to me. Then I did freelance writing on all those shows before I got on staff. And in all of them, I learned something about how a room should be run. And one of the first things I teach my students is that you should take a class in psychology. You need to know how to read a room and know how to behave in the room with people. And that's something that sometimes people don't know. So it's a silly thing, but it's true. On this episode, Smokescreen, we have two people, Roma Downey, who was an Irish-American woman, and Della Reese, who was an African-American woman. They would pretend to be other people in people's lives. In this particular episode, Roma always did more work because she was younger, and Della only worked 3 days a week because she was in her 70s. They were going to have Roma portray this gentleman's lawyer, and Della portray his maid. And I understood how upsetting that would be to my African-American friends if yet another maid character was portrayed by an African-American woman. So I said we shouldn't do that. What if we switched it? And the problem was production. Della didn't have many hours in the week to do that filming. So we could have ended the idea there, but I was a little pushy then, and I wanted the movement. And I suggested we ask her, would she be willing to work an extra day that week for the chance not to play a maid? And guess what she said? Exactly. So it was about understanding production and how that operates. In this particular episode, I was doing a piece about a married couple that were using their children as weapons during the divorce. And I wanted that lesson to be don't do that. And I had to bring in memories of Mrs. Doubtfire, because on my show I was afraid the answer would be, don't get divorced. And that's not an honest answer to young children whose parents are getting divorced. So happily, when Robin Williams did this film, he only agreed to do it if in the end the couple never got back together, since he was a divorced man and he didn't want to lie to his kids. So I took that lesson and I made sure that one of the parents was already remarried. So I thought that was kind of fun, but I had to go around the desires of my executive producer in order to make sure that I got what I wanted, right? So you have to learn the people in the room. And then there were many, many stories in this one, particularly, very quickly, there were people in the room who wanted to shoot down your ideas, again, reading the room. And I had an idea about dealing with teenage young men who were fathers and lived in gangs. And they had to make a commitment to their real family, not their gang family. I knew that someone else in the room would not want me to have the extra script that year, because that's a nice chunk of money he would rather have. So my joke is, I followed my executive producer into the bathroom, because she was a woman and so was I. And then I pitched her while we were washing our hands, so that when we walked back in the room, she already liked the idea, and for someone else to shoot it down would be to say she had a bad idea, and therefore I got what I wanted. So reading the room has always been a very important lesson, as well as remembering that doctors have power. Whenever you think about side characters, think about making them ethnic, because that's really important. And then these are just the things that I learned from the room. You have to do research. You have to think about your nightmares. You have to speak up. I teach my female students this all the time. Please speak up. Don't wait for the boys to give you a moment, because they won't. And then I learned a lot. And then I will briefly just say teachers make great writers, because they do. And collaboration doesn't just happen in TV, right? Because these guys collaborated on those films. We have to recognize that. So collaboration and chaos makes good quality presentations.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry.